let's get started. So first and foremost, happy Data Privacy Day, everybody. We are very excited to have our special guest, Anthony Prestia, today for this special edition of the Privacy Exchange Community's Show and Tell series. This is a sponsored webinar, so thank you to TerraTrue for sponsoring this. Anthony is the VP of TerraTrue, and in our session today with him, we'll discuss how he helps companies get proactive on their privacy, security, third-party risk, and AI governance programs. We will hear about Anthony's past experiences running a privacy program at a company that was under FTC consent decree. We'll talk about the common risk management issues that Anthony sees across companies today, and we'll discuss the unified data risk forward future his clients at TerraTrue have in store for the year ahead. So for today's webinar, we're going to follow our similar format that we typically do, which is a 15 to 20-minute interview with Anthony and me, followed by audience Q&A, where we will turn off the recording. So feel free to ask whatever question you want. It will not be recorded during the Q&A session. In addition to the funds that we have raised from this sponsored webinar that have supported the Privacy Exchange community, and as I mentioned at the top of the hour, one visual of that is our new branding that we were able to purchase. Today's webinar is also helping a good cause. We are doing 2 donations today in support of data privacy today. The first donation is a $500 donation to the Plunk Foundation, where I and several other of our community members are advisors to that organization. So on top of that first 500, we also have a fun activity that can raise an additional 500. So every time on today's webinar with Anthony and me or anyone in the audience, if you hear 2 words, the word risk or the word resilience, we are going to donate an additional dollar up to $500. So there's $1,000 at stake for today's donation. So please do participate, keep your ears peeled for those 2 words, and feel free to chime in the chat with your own risk or resilience to up the donation amount. I also would like to take this moment to thank our fellow community member, Kimberly Lancaster at Avalon Privacy, who generously decided to match our initial donation. So she is donating $500 additional dollars. So today's donation stemming from the Privacy Exchange Community's organization today is $1,500. So thank you, Kimberly. All right, so before we hop in, I just want to remind everyone that today's session is for informational purposes only. This is not legal advice. If you need legal advice, contact your own attorney. So with all that behind us, Anthony, are you ready to hop in?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Okay, so Anthony, my first question for you is, you have a storied career. I was like enthralled hearing about it the first time we talked. So I'd like you to share a little bit about what you were doing before you became the VP of Privacy at TerraTrue, particularly with the FTC stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And first of all, thanks everyone for joining us on Data Privacy Day. You could have spent it with anyone, and I'm glad you chose me. But I've been in the privacy space for roughly 15 years at this point. I started, I think probably many of us in the space know Professor Dan Solov. He's a prolific writer and hosts quite a few events of his own, but I had the good fortune of being in one of his first classes, either like the second or third year he started teaching, and I got to know him really well. What helped him create some materials for his Teach Privacy startup that provides, training and counseling to a variety of companies. And as I was in law school, I was kind of like, I don't know if big law is something I'm really interested in doing, but I'd love to find some opportunities to work in privacy. So Dan did some introductions for me, and my first job was actually working at a nonprofit. It was a trade group called the NAI, which some of you may be familiar with, but was really the trade for ad tech privacy. And I worked on the regulatory program there. And at the time, this was, pre-iPhone, so we were really worried about using cookies for cross-site advertising, and the membership was pretty small at the time. It was like AOL, Yahoo, Google. Some of these companies we know well, some we may not think about quite as much anymore. But I got to write the first principles around mobile advertising at that time and really work on the compliance program there. From that work, I built a lot of relationships with customers, and then eventually had outreach from the partner who led the privacy group at Perkins Coie, who was in Seattle at the time, working with a lot of the membership at the NAI, as well as someone I used to work with, Meredith Hamala, who leads the privacy group at Perkins now and is just a generally great person. And they said, hey, would you think about coming here? Most of our customers are down in the Bay Area, but we're all up in Seattle, and we'd really like a privacy attorney to just kind of be boots on the ground in San Francisco. I was in DC at the time, always liked visiting San Francisco, and thought, hey, that sounds fun, and the folks I met there were nice, so I went and did that. Um, I was doing this for a couple years, and then I did something I don't recommend any of you do. I started secondments at the same time with Google and Snapchat. So Mondays, I was working in Google's office full time. I had, my Google laptop and email, and I was there. And then I was there Monday, Tuesday, and then I'd fly down to Los Angeles to work at Snapchat on Wednesday and Thursday every week, again with my whole Snapchat laptop and email address I had to keep track of. And then I'd fly back to San Francisco and work out of my office on Fridays. I did that for about 6 months, which is far longer than anyone should ever keep that sort of working arrangement. And I guess one thing I did discover there was I was right when I was in law school. I didn't really want to do big law. I did not like tracking my billable hours and all of that fun stuff. So I got an opportunity to work at either of those companies. I did, the sensible thing and said, no, why would I work at the public tech company with a set of really smart privacy and product attorneys, and said, I'm going to work for the startup that already has an FTC consent decree, lives on the beach, has no privacy team at all, and is really sort of may or may not pan out. But it was a unique opportunity, I think, to build something from scratch. I loved the team I was working with there on my secondment. They had just hired a general counsel and their first chief information security officer, who I work with at TerraTrue now. And I kind of wanted to build something fresh and figured when else was I going to get a chance to both live and work on Venice Beach? And if it didn't pan out, I could always go back to a law firm, right? So I joined Snap, and that was my role immediately prior to TerraTrue. I was the lone privacy attorney as when I joined, and our goal there was really to say, hey, look, we've got this FTC consent decree. We're going to have yearly audits on our privacy program. We were in a fast-growing company at the time. We were hiring upwards of 70 people every single week. So we had to do onboarding into our privacy program for 70 plus people every Monday morning, and really kind of grow as we were doing multiple acquisitions, getting ready to IPO. The GDPR came into effect during that period of time. The CCPA came into effect during that period of time. So it was a lot to manage over quite a few years. So I did that, grew with that team. Eventually, after we went public, the general counsel and chief information security officer did what executives at newly public companies do and took a little time off while I was continuing to kind of grind away. But they reached out at some point and said, hey, we're thinking about starting a company to build tooling that we wish we had had when we were building the program at Snap, instead of trying to do all this work in Google Sheets and Docs and showing up in random meetings and things like that. Would you be interested in doing it? And as always, I am not particularly risk averse in my career, and I went ahead and said, "Yeah, that sounds great," and joined the team over there as kind of the lone person. So the three of us built TerraTrue out, and I've been doing that for about 6 years now. So long answer to a simple question, but I hope at least folks are getting a sense of, look, there's a lot of different careers available in privacy, and you kind of never really know the different paths that are going to lead you where you want to end up.
Wow, I would say I would characterize your story career as one of resilience. That was
Perfect.
fascinating, Anthony, and thank you for explaining how you got to TerraTrue. So, one thing in your role is you get to see a lot of customers come in at different points of their maturity and then align to a TerraTrue standard. I'd really like to know what's the state of affairs? Like, how are people coming in and where are they ending up from your perspective, like a eagle eye perspective?
For sure. I kind of have a framework I keep in my mind that we had to develop over the last 6 years as we've reached out to companies to see where we fit, and really have gotten a sense for what the maturity curve I think looks like for different companies in privacy. Um, certainly this can change if you're a company that's like dealing with products directed at children, or if you're in a highly regulated industry like banks or healthcare or things like that that may need to consider privacy earlier on. But I think generally the spectrum we see are, you have your initial startups that are just trying to put something together, maybe raise an angel round, something like that, and build something. And they're not particularly concerned with privacy at that point. They have no real customers. They're just trying to make something work. And obviously, well, obvious to me, maybe not to folks on the call, we're not a great fit for those quite yet because they can't really take advantage of what we're doing. I think just past that startup phase, you start seeing companies that now they've built something, maybe they have a little bit of angel funding. And I like to think of this as like the privacy starter pack. And I think there are quite a lot of law firms and advisors that will help with this, which is to say, hey, we're going to draft you a privacy policy. We're going to make sure you get like a cookie banner or things like that up on your website, maybe an email address, privacy at your domain to take requests, things like that. And again, this is not a spot where we're particularly useful yet. And I do think there are a lot of good products out there at a low price point for things like getting a cookie banner up on your website, or even getting some advice on how to structure your notices, things like that. Just past that, I think you're getting to these companies that are tending to get a little more conscious on privacy. Maybe they've raised that Series A, maybe they've hired a general counsel, something like that. And this is where we start to see a couple things. First, oftentimes, I do think these customers are looking at third-party risk before they're looking at sort of their own privacy program. And I think there's good reasons to do that. One being, if you're a small enough startup, if I'm somebody, a malicious actor, it's better to go after one of these third parties used by a whole bunch of companies rather than just this small startup, right? So in some ways that makes sense. This work will often be spearheaded by a security team or a privacy team. There's a mix we see there. And then the other thing that they'll be trying to do is really wrap their head around what's already been built in the past, right? So at this point, you've got a few customers, you've built this product. What data have we already collected? Is any of it high risk? What's the most important for our underlying business model? Like if we couldn't collect this data anymore, if it leaked, it would really just kind of tank the business, understanding that. So doing this data mapping exercise to look back. This is not where our platform initially launched, because I do think there are quite a few products in this space and some of them are commoditized. But eventually we built functionality because it complements our core platform that I'll talk about in a minute quite well. But this is a spot where we help. And I think in the third-party risk space, what you do there is really going to depend on your size and could evolve over time. If you're a small company with not a lot of vendors, you may be able to do just fine managing those vendors, getting some standardized sort of templates you send out to those vendors, identify risks, send recommendations back to the business, work with your commercial team, maybe to negotiate terms with that vendor, things like that. And there are some great organizations out there that give templates for that. The minimum viable security product is one that we partner with a fair bit, and things like that. But you may be one of these companies, and this is increasingly true, or you're a small startup, but you have 50, 60 vendors and it keeps growing because they're using them for everything. And that's where we offer something that can help companies scale there by having some of these default templates, rescheduling yearly reviews, coordinating with different teams internally, those sorts of things. And on the sort of understanding where data lives within your company, again, you've got the manual approach that may be good enough for you, right? Get a conference room, sit down with your CTO for an hour and see what you can learn and then dig from there, or send out a survey across the business to figure out how data is being used. Or you could use a product like ours or some competing ones in the marketplace where you can plug it into systems, scan data, try to classify it automatically, assign risk to it, things like that. So you can sort of build out a data map in a more automated way. Past that, I think this last bucket could really vary, right? But it's where I think you start getting more proactive about privacy. So you found product market fit, you've got customers, you're growing, you're raising funding, these sorts of things. And what you really want to do is shift your overall privacy program further left. You want to get more involved at the ideation phase to identify risks and provide feedback to the business that has a whole lot of benefits, right? One, you're saving the company money potentially because they're not going to build a thing that you eventually have to say, oh no, this is never going to work. We're either straight up violating this law or we're introducing too much risk, those sorts of things. And then you have to go back and re-engineer the thing, which is not a great use of anyone's time. But you can also come up with more, I think, creative solutions to privacy problems. If you're just being brought in after something launches or just before it launches, you can say yes or no, and that's your entire toolkit. But if you're brought in earlier, you can actually partner with PMs and engineers to help them understand here are risks, here are different ways we can address them, and maybe come to a more creative solution that everybody ends up happier with in the long run, which I think is very important. So this proactive phase evolves over time. And this is again where you can start lightweight like we did at Snap, where we had a Google Sheet that would be essentially the product roadmap. Here's what we're releasing on this date. Has security looked at it? Has privacy looked at it? Meeting with those teams in person to walk through your product specs, understand what data is going to be collected, who's the target audience for this? Are we rolling it out in just the US, or are we rolling it out in like Saudi Arabia, which may have very different privacy concerns when it comes to photos and location and things like that. So you may be able to do it with those forms and sheets, but eventually you're going to hit a point where tooling is really going to make a difference because you need to make sure you're driving adoption, that you're kind of minimizing the busy work and really focus, like documentation, a lot of documentation requirements under these privacy laws. And you want to focus on kind of the novel challenges and not so much the raw data collection that can eat up kind of too much time. So that's the main space, I think, where we play as a platform is like a single source of truth for all these different review functions. Privacy and security being our bread and butter, but obviously, and I think we'll talk a bit about this a little bit, things like, AI governance and others are really being brought into this same fold. These teams have a lot of the same questions, a lot of the same concerns out of the gate, and you don't want to keep bothering PMs and engineers who are very busy with the same questions over and over again from these different review functions. Instead, get everyone aligned and kind of triage and send that work out to the relevant folks. So that's kind of where we do is we try to help people hit that scale when they want to go proactive and then also a little bit further down market say, look, how do we manage our third party vendor risk? How do we do some overall sort of like data discovery? Hopefully that was a useful answer. I know I said quite a lot.
Absolutely. What I took away from that is, really getting away from this like reactive state to a more resilient state.
Yes.
On that, folks, to be more proactive, and that's really where you come in. And so we talked about third-party risk, security, and privacy. One other area that you did mention is AI governance, and this is kind of an interesting double-edged sword for privacy professionals because some folks got like voluntold. In addition to their privacy, responsibilities, are now doing AI governance. And this is a cool opportunity on the one hand, where it's like, oh my gosh, this is a lot of work. It's a new space. What am I doing? But on the other hand, it's a hot topic. People are really excited about it. You can get the budget to get the tools that will unlock that proactive approach. So you're not just doing documentation, you're not just doing data flows to your point, but really, what can I bring to make this company better and have that toolkit, not just the yes or no. So tell us a little bit about what you're seeing from your perspective when it comes to AI governance.
Yeah, this has sort of been a non-stop point of discussion over the last at least year, possibly two. Um, I always like taking a look at those IAPP privacy governance reports every year to see the survey results. And the one that I've kept in my back pocket from last year is essentially privacy budgets have stayed flat since 2022, but it was over 80% of privacy teams are being given more responsibility. And that includes AI. And within sort of our base of customers, we've seen a little more than half of them have to take over ownership for AI governance, even if it wasn't aligned with sort of their past mandate for that function. So I think the resource crunch is real and that privacy professionals are really having to start think about AI risk overall. And to your point, I think, yes, this is an opportunity to grab some resources in some cases, right? To secure resources that you may not have had before. Over the last few years in the tech space, in particular, which is where a lot of our customers do come from, there's been a real demand, I think, for privacy teams and to a lesser extent, some security teams to really justify the value that they're providing back to the business. There have been significant layoffs within tech. I don't think that's news to anyone. And folks are really looking at where they can trim, whether that is through vendors or even internally into programs that aren't kind of helping the bottom line. And for a long time, and I have some separate thoughts on this, certainly demonstrating the value of a privacy program can be quite difficult sometimes if the value you're focusing on is, hey, we didn't get fined, right? That like proving a negative thing is not particularly useful. I think there are other ways about that, which maybe we can dive into later. But AI is another opportunity to do that, where I do think people in many cases are seeing AI as a value driver for customers or a way to gain efficiency for their internal programs. And to the extent you as a team can help adoption of those tools or development of them, there are some ways to collect some metrics to potentially show that value and get more resources to drive this kind of like business critical mandate a lot of people are having. So on one hand, I think that's very useful. The other challenge here, though, is that, okay, great, maybe I've gotten some more resources, but I still have to deal with this new challenge of understanding AI risk and what do we do here? And I think jury's out still on what the right approach is. Me personally, I think a multidisciplinary approach is sort of the best one, and this is going to rely on a lot of collaboration with other teams. But I am kind of broadly supportive of this idea that privacy professionals and teams generally are pretty well positioned to manage the overall process, even if they don't deal with each individual aspect of it. And so, from my experience and like seeing what our customers are doing, I think this tends to be true for a few reasons. The first would be those of us working in privacy for many years now, I think are plenty aware that AI is a fun marketing term for like the same ML we've been reviewing for automated decision making and things like this for many, many years. It just has access to more data and more compute. So they're able to do some sort of more novel and interesting things with it. But we at least have been thinking about these issues for a while, so it's not brand new, which is a great place to start. Two, I think that if you've built a proactive privacy program like we were talking about before, you're already plugged into, your product roadmap. You understand what your marketing team wants to do. You have great relationships with your like internal teams offering benefits to employees that may involve data collection, things like that. So you are best positioned to help potentially identify when AI is going to be deployed and then route it to the right people, whether that's you or someone else who can kind of do the review, provide advice, things like that. So I'm optimistic about that aspect for privacy teams handling this. I don't. Do you want me to dive into like how I'm thinking about AI specifically a little bit? I know we're getting tight on time, but I think I have some thoughts on how I've been addressing it from a privacy perspective, for sure.
Well, to your point, this is fascinating, and we probably should have made this a lot longer because this is super interesting. Let's take a beat. Let's open this up to audience Q&A.